Main events should always be the best part of the show. Like any decent piece of storytelling, you really want to close any wrestling gig with something that the audience will love. If they are enamored by the main event, it's more likely that they'll forget any mistakes you made earlier on in the show, and the overall impression of the show will be much better. WWE usually understands this, and they normally put everything they can into making their main event as memorable as possible. Sometimes though, their brains seem to explode and they put forward a main event that is woefully executed, simply leaving a foul taste in the mouths of everybody who is watching the show. Poor execution is one thing, but what is really infuriating is when a main event is put forward to the audience that is just simply boring. When it comes to making your main event feel special, WWE really drop the balls with these ones. My name's Adam Nicholas, and these are the 10 most boring WWE main events of all time. Number 10, King of the Ring 1995. Diesel and Bam Bam Bigelow versus Psycho Sid and Tatanka. 1995 was an absolutely horrifying, seeping wound of a year for the WWF. While many like to point to that year's WrestleMania as being indicative of just how bad the product was at the time, a compelling case can be made that it was the King of the Ring that showcased the creative nadir the organization had hit. King of the Ring featured literally 0 title matches. Not even the main event featured anything worth fighting for, and yet punters were expected to actually pay to watch this dumpster fire. More significantly though, the main event featured one of the most unpopular champions in the company's history in Diesel in a brain-shatteringly boring tag match in front of an audience who provided all the atmosphere of a funeral. Now, Kevin Nash was never the greatest worker at the best of times, but with an injured elbow, he was particularly woeful in this bout. To make matters worse, this abomination came towards the end of an absolutely turgid feud between Big Daddy Cool and Sid, who in some people's eyes wasn't even a great wrestler in his peak, and people weren't even slightly interested in seeing how the story panned out. When Nash somehow managed to pin Tatanka for the win, despite basically doing nothing during the bout, the match and the entire pay-per-view were mercifully put out of their misery. Number 9, December to Dismember 2006, Elimination Chamber. It's pretty hard to screw up an Elimination Chamber match, isn't it? I mean, it's a big cage, it's a lot of people, it's a lot of violence. Sounds pretty good to me. Even when they turn into a disaster, they can normally be entertaining, as evidenced by the one where Dolph Ziggler took control and told everybody what to do live on a pay-per-view. Wasn't that lovely? However, December to Dismembers proved to be the exception to the rule, even though it featured CM Punk and Rob Van Dam. The reason why it's so boring is because the match burned through the best talent in the ring ridiculously fast. In a contest that featured those stalwarts of boredom, Test and Bob Holly, CM Punk was the first person to be eliminated. And while Holly was next to go, any optimism for the fate of Rob Van Dam was quickly squashed when he was the next one to go out. That meant that it was up to Test, The Big Show, and an incredibly green Bobby Lashley to carry the remainder of the match. Understandably, the results were disastrous. The three giants plodded through some awkwardly delivered spots with the excitement of a tax return and all of the timing of a broken watch. To make things even worse though, everyone knew exactly where the match was going, so any surprise or excitement factor was completely removed. Instead, we sadly got treated to 3 boring wrestlers constructing an ending everybody knew was coming. I think Paul Heyman's face said it all, really, didn't it? Number 8, King of the Ring 2002, Triple H versus The Undertaker. This match has less imagination than Michael Bay, and for long stretches it felt more like the world's worst boxing match as opposed to a WWE main event. Whenever people talk about Triple H as being one of the greatest champions of all time, they should really revisit matches like this. He was so massive at this point that he could barely move, let alone string together some meaningful action, and to add fuel to this dumpster fire, he was having to face The Undertaker in the dead man's worst incarnation. It's hard to really find the words to justify how plodding and mind-bogglingly slow this match actually was. Both men looked like they would rather have been anywhere else than in the ring that day, and both of these seasoned veterans looked as though they'd completely forgotten what it was they came in to do. The whole thing consists of nothing but trading punches for the majority of the match, with a couple of depressingly pedestrian maneuvers pulled in that immediately just get turned into methodical punching volleys once again. And then the final third of the match turned into an absolute sell-off between these two behemoths. Both men spent enough time on the mat to make you feel like they must have just wrestled the most intense Iron Man match this side of HBK and the Hitman, instead of the most unimaginable and groan-inducing main event of the year. Even an appearance from the most electrifying man in sports entertainment, The Rock, couldn't make this farce even marginally entertaining. And by the time The Undertaker hits a low blow and a roll-up for the win, yes, I'm not kidding, it feels like you've been watching the match for 20 hours, not 20 minutes. Number 7, WrestleMania 8, Hulk Hogan vs Sid Justice. Hulk Hogan was entertaining and, to be fair, still is despite all of his problematic nature, but that's another story altogether. But even the most desperate Hulk Hogan marks can't deny that in terms of in-ring ability, he's probably one of the worst champions to have ever held the WWE Championship. And in a company that had Jinder Mahal as champion once, that's saying something. So when a well and truly past his prime Hogan was put into the main event of the biggest show of the year with the equally clueless Sid, the results were as uninspiring and brutally tedious as anyone with any wrestling experience could have predicted. Literally nothing happens in this match. It's simply a collection of rest holds and stare downs with the most cursory attempts at a couple of wrestling tricks just to maintain some semblance of legitimacy. Neither man could carry a match on their own, so the fact that they hadn't any idea what to do when they realised they had to carry one isn't unsurprising either, really. What is surprising, however, is that nobody actually planned for this to begin with, and that they let this shipwreck keep inching towards the iceberg as an increasingly bored audience looked on. The only moment that gave the match any interest whatsoever was the return from the Ultimate Warrior, who'd been out of the organisation for months. Even Papa Shango's botched run-in couldn't save the contest from abject tedium. Number 6, In Your House D-Generation X, Shawn Michaels vs Ken Shamrock. This travesty of a pay-per-view came just 4 weeks after the Montreal Screwjob, so it's fair to assume that the organisation wasn't necessarily running all that smoothly at the time. Even so, the main event should have been at least halfway entertaining. After an excruciatingly long wait for the match to start, things go okay for a little bit. Just a little bit. The problem here, though, is that HBK takes over relatively early, and he gets mad that he's dealing with someone who, quite frankly, doesn't know what the hell they're doing. I mean, Shamrock was cool and all, but I think he was fairly limited. Michaels basically stops trying to even hide that he's calling the spots and spends half the match bailing on the ring. The whole thing is completely uneven, completely unconvincing, and once it gets started going past the quarter-hour mark without an end in sight, it's fairly noticeable just what a tough watch this actually is. Now, all of Michaels' ego and all of Shamrock's inexperience could probably be forgiven, but all we needed was a decent payoff, and yet there wasn't. The match finishes with an interruption that is as predictable as it is lame, and the whole thing just sums up an otherwise entirely woeful card in an appropriate, albeit astonishingly dry fashion. Number 5, the Great American Bash 2005, JBL versus Batista. Now, it still boggles the mind of many to this day that JBL was ever the main man in the WWE. But 2005 was a dark time for the brand extension, as SmackDown became a poorer and poorer cousin to Monday Night Raw with each passing week. Few shows eliminated just how dreadful things actually were, quite like the Great American Bash, the main event of which was so brutally mundane, lifeless, and absolutely pointless, to be honest. The main takeaway from this match, like many others on this list, is that every aspect of the match was just so inert it was almost stationary. As most single brand pay-per-views of the era were, the card was very underbooked, so JBL and Batista needed to pad this one out as long as possible to try to get the pay-per-view to a respectable running time. As a result, the entrances are pointlessly extravagant, which test the patience of the live audience and the viewers at home too. When the match does finally get underway, it actually starts off fairly interesting, to be honest, but both guys are enormous, and because of this, they're gassed in an incredibly short time. This fatigue leads to a ludicrously long sleeper hold from JBL that, to be fair, in real life would probably lead to some sort of severe brain damage. It then kills any momentum that the match had, and it's all kind of downhill from there. The two big bits of beef trade power blows before every screw job trick is pulled out of the old WWE cliche handbook. There's a ref bump, there's a chair shot that the ref didn't see, and of course there's the inevitable chair shot from face Batista to heel JBL, which cost the form of the match. The finish was so painfully telegraphed and transparent that it only made the plodding pace and ridiculous duration of the match all the more noticeable. Number 4, In Your House, Great White North, Diesel versus British Bulldog. Now, given how insipid and trite the majority of Diesel's WWF career was, it's no surprise that he featured in another dismal main event that is difficult to keep your eyes open throughout. Great White North is often referred to as the worst WWE pay-per-view, and it's hard to argue with that considering the snooze fest of a match that was supposed to be the pinnacle of the card. But why anybody allowed Davey Boy Smith to try and craft this bout into a mat classic is even more confusing. Both of these guys could have at least traded some stiff impact moves or tried to wow the crowd with displays of strength. Instead, the majority of the match is kept on the mat, and the results are just punishing for everybody involved. For the best part of 20 minutes, Kevin Nash just basically lies down, which would have been right up his street, I'm sure, teasing comebacks against the Bulldog's submission maneuvers. It's nigh on impossible to translate into words just how much time slows down when you're watching Nash sell these rest holds for 20 minutes. But rest assured, dear viewers, for go back and watch it, and you'll feel like you've aged when you watch this match. match. Inevitably, all this build-up leads to a classic WWF disqualification, which meant that there was literally no payoff for any of this insufferable garbage. And even Vinnie Mac knew that this match was about as exciting as a fart in a lift, and he reportedly dressed down Nash after the match. And when you got Vince McMahon telling you that a rest hold's a problem, well, that's when you know something's gone wrong. Number 3, Survivor Series 2008, Triple H versus Vladimir Kozlov. This match is so unfathomably boring that at one point the crowd can be heard chanting for TNA, of all things. That, in of itself, is really all that needs to be said about this absolute disaster of a match. As a rookie, Kozlov didn't really have any chance of making a good impression in this match. He was supposed to be a technical wrestler, and thus he tried to bring that element of his character to the match. The problem was he was facing Triple H, who had to lead the match with his arsenal of 4 moves. The crowd had been expecting Jeff Hardy until he was attacked backstage and thus couldn't fight, which, as you can imagine, went down really well. If Hardy had started the match, it could have been an interesting clash of styles. Instead, what we got was a bunch of okay-ish looking holds, followed by reversals, followed by more holds, followed by, guess what, more reversals. Even when Kozlov tried impact moves, they were low impact moves that weren't really that exciting. And Triple H did nothing to help change the pace because, well, Triple H. A couple of run-ins later by Edge and Hardy, who apparently was okay now, so that's quite a good thing. The whole thing just turned into a confusing snooze fest. By the time that match was mercifully concluded with an awkwardly instituted screw job, the damage was already done. Kozlov would be remembered as a boring guy who couldn't carry a match, and he'd be gone from the company within 3 years. Number 2, WrestleMania 25, Triple H versus Randy Orton. Now this was basically your standard Randy Orton and/or Triple H match. It was technically sound, it was perfectly adequate, and aesthetically, it certainly looked fine. Like all of their matches though, it was about as original as an episode of SmackDown back then, and about as exciting as a Stephanie McMahon promo. Now, to be fair, in isolation, this match might not appear to be as bad as it was. If it was just an episode of Raw where you're just constructing an episode with, you know, a filler match here and there, then you'd probably be stuck. Unfortunately, this was a WrestleMania main event, and it was the main event on a stacked card that had already featured one of the greatest matches in company history. Basically, these two plodded through the curtain at Gorilla, knowing full well this was going to stink. And as they came up with the same spots that we've all seen before, it wasn't really a great start. There was also a stipulation where Triple H would lose the title if he was disqualified. This was, of course, a great idea in theory, because the DQ stipulation had always been a bugbear for wrestling fans. But given what had come before this match, it should have been abandoned, as this fight could have used anything at all to make it more interesting. Sadly, you just can't top an Undertaker-Shawn Michaels match. Unfortunately, relying on Triple H and Randy Orton's limited movesets made this one just too uninspired to be remembered as anything other than a real boring letdown, and a sad closing to the biggest show of the year. And number 1, SummerSlam 1994, Undertaker versus The Undertaker. Now, what on earth are you meant to say about this match? There's no possible way that viewers could ever get invested in something so stupid, literally no matter what the age of them. But matches that are stupid can at least be entertaining. This one, however, was absolutely boring as hell, even by the standards of mid-90s WWF. Now, the whole lead up to the match doesn't really need repeating, to be honest, because it's ancient history and it'll make you feel really sad. All you need to know is that in a desperate attempt to give this tacky abomination some sort of gravitas, the match starts with a slow motion posturing and stare down that became more and more agitating as the wait for anything to actually happen grew longer and longer. All in all, there's some slow motion punches, there's an Irish whip, and then fake Undertaker goes for a break on the outside, as if he's earned a breather from all that intense in-ring action that he's just delivered to those fans. Good for you, fake Undertaker. From then on, it's basically the same old garbage repeated over and over and over and over again, as if both these guys are just wrestling in sand. Now, I'll be honest, you don't need to watch this match. In fact, you shouldn't. Maybe you should just forget it even happened. Just take my word for it and you'll have a better life. But if you're really curious to know what it's like, all you need to do is imagine all the worst parts of an Undertaker match turned up to 11 and then double them. Undertaker squared. What a wonderful thing that is. It's unbearable, it's harrowing, and it's tiresome beyond logical comprehension. And it's hard to believe that a year later, things would somehow get even worse in the WWF.